Alexander Hawthorne adjusted his Italian silk tie as he gazed out at New York City through the windows of his office atop one of the most prestigious skyscrapers on Park Avenue. At 45, he had built an empire in real estate, but his greatest challenge wasn't in any spreadsheet or contract on his mahogany desk. It was at home, probably up to his usual mischief. Ethan, his 12-year-old son, had become an enigma that not even all his financial resources could decipher. That very morning, he had received a call from the school, the third that month, about the boy's behavior. This time, he had organized an art exhibition in the schoolyard, using his classmates' backpacks. The principal didn't find it amusing to see dozens of backpacks hanging from the garden trees. "Mr. Hawthorne?" The voice of Sarah, his secretary of over a decade, interrupted his thoughts. "Mrs. Carmen is on the phone. It's about Ethan. Again." Alexander sighed deeply before answering. Carmen was the 10th nanny in less than 2 years, a highly recommended professional with experience in difficult cases. But apparently, all her experience hadn't been enough to handle Ethan. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hawthorne, but I can't continue." Carmen's voice trembled. "Your son, he put paint in my designer handbag, an original Hermes, and when I tried to talk to him, he said that..." She paused as if needing courage to continue. "He said I was just another gold digger trying to con his father." Alexander closed his eyes, feeling the weight of those words. Ethan had been increasingly out of control since Olivia, his ex-wife, had left without looking back 5 years ago, leaving only a note saying she wasn't born to be a mother. "Carmen, please, we can talk about this. I can buy you a new bag and..." "It's not about the bag, Mr. Hawthorne," she interrupted him, something rare coming from an employee. "It's about not being able to establish any connection with Ethan. He needs something I can't offer. I'm sorry, but today will be my last day." After hanging up, Alexander remained silent, observing the city that stretched to the horizon. He had the power to buy and sell entire buildings with a single signature, but he couldn't fix what was broken inside his own home. The afternoon was advancing when he decided to leave the office early, something virtually unprecedented in his routine. In the panoramic elevator, he adjusted his tie once more, an automatic gesture that betrayed his nervousness. He needed to find a solution. He couldn't watch his son sinking deeper into that spiral of rebellion and pain. On the way home, passing through Central Park, something caught his attention. A young woman, probably in her 30s, was trying to balance several shopping bags while a girl of about 8 years old jumped around her, telling some story with so much enthusiasm that she almost knocked over one of the bags. "Sophie, please, I need to concentrate," the woman was saying, but her tone was affectionate and a smile played on her lips. "If you keep jumping like that, we're going to end up dropping the whole dinner." The girl immediately stopped, assuming a serious posture that seemed comical. In someone so small. "Sorry, Mom, let me help." She picked up one of the bags, almost as big as she was. Alexander observed the scene through the car window, feeling something strange in his chest. The way the woman dealt with her daughter, firm but loving, and how the little one responded with so much affection. It was something that seemed so distant from his reality with Ethan. It was then that one of the bags really did fall, scattering. Oranges on the sidewalk. Without thinking twice, Alexander asked Richard, his driver, to stop the car. He quickly got out, approaching to help. "Let me help you with that," he offered, starting to collect the fruit. The woman seemed surprised by the gesture. Up close, Alexander noticed her intense green eyes and an expression that mixed fatigue and determination. "Thank you," she said, and her voice had a soft but firm quality. "Sophie, thank the gentleman." "Thank you, mister," the girl smiled, revealing a gap between her front teeth. While helping to collect the groceries, Alexander couldn't help but notice the basic products in the bags. This woman clearly lived a very different reality from his, but there was something in her posture, in the way she interacted with her daughter, that intrigued him deeply. "Can I offer you a ride?" he found himself asking, surprising himself. "I have a driver and it looks like you have a lot to carry." The woman hesitated, studying him with a cautious look. "That's very kind, but we don't know you." "I'm sorry. How rude of me." "Alexander Hawthorne," he introduced himself, extending his hand. "Real estate entrepreneur." Emma Collins, she replied, briefly shaking his hand. Public school teacher. And this is my daughter, Sophie. Emma hesitated for a few moments before accepting the ride. Something in the tired look of this well-dressed businessman intrigued her. There was a mixture of power and vulnerability that didn't match his imposing appearance. Sophie, on the other hand, was already completely at ease, chatting animatedly with Richard, the driver, about her day at school. I live in Brooklyn Heights, Emma explained, settling into the leather seat of the Mercedes. On Orange Street. Alexander raised his eyebrows, surprised. Coincidence. I live a few blocks from there on Willow Street. I work as a teacher at a public school in the area, Emma commented, noticing his curious look. I managed to rent a small apartment at a reasonable price. It's important to me that Sophie attends a good public school, and there's an excellent one in the neighborhood. As they talked, Alexander noticed how Emma kept a constant eye on Sophie, even when the girl was engrossed in her own thoughts. It was a natural care, without exaggeration or neurosis, something he secretly envied. And Sophie's father? The question escaped before he could contain it, and Alexander immediately regretted the indiscretion. Emma, however, didn't seem fazed. It's a complicated story. He decided he wasn't ready to be a father when he found out about my pregnancy. I prefer to say that we're a compact family, Sophie and I. She smiled, but there was a shadow of hurt in her eyes. It must be difficult. It's challenging, she interrupted him, her tone firm but without hostility. But I've learned that complaining doesn't solve anything. Sophie is my strength and my joy. Every sacrifice is worth it when I see her smile. The car stopped in front of an old but well-maintained building. Sophie was already ready to jump, out eager to show her mother a drawing she had made at school. Thank you very much for the ride, Mr. Hawthorne. Please, call me Alexander. He hesitated for a moment, then took a card from his pocket. Emma, I know this will seem strange, but I'd like to talk to you about a job proposal. She took the card cautiously. What kind of job? I have a son, he began, choosing his words carefully. Ethan, 12 years old, he is going through a difficult time. Today, I lost another nanny. I'm sorry, but I don't work as a nanny, Emma responded promptly. I'm a teacher. I have my career. The salary would be 3 times what you currently earn, Alexander blurted out, feeling he was losing a unique opportunity. You could bring Sophie. You'd have your own room in the mansion. All expenses paid, premium health insurance. Emma frowned, her green eyes flashing. Mr. Hawthorne, I appreciate the offer, but I'm not for sale. Neither am I, nor my professional dignity. That's not what I meant, Alexander hurried to clarify. I saw how you handle Sophie. The connection between you, it's something special. Ethan needs that. He needs someone who knows how to be firm without losing tenderness. Emma observed the man in front of her. Behind the facade of a powerful magnate, there was a desperate father. She could see that now clearly. Why don't you tell me more about Ethan? She found herself asking, surprising herself. We could have coffee sometime. Alexander's face lit up. How about tomorrow? I can stop by the school after your shift. Mom, come on, Sophie called from the entrance, hugging her drawing. I want to show you what I made. Emma smiled at her daughter and then turned to Alexander. Tomorrow at 5 p.m., but I'm not promising anything beyond a conversation. As the car drove away, Alexander felt a glimmer of hope. For the first time in a long time, he glimpsed a possibility of real change. In her apartment, Emma helped Sophie with her homework while reflecting on the strange encounter that afternoon. The proposal was tempting. The money would solve many of her problems, but she had learned the hard way that some decisions needed to go beyond the financial aspect. Mom, Sophie interrupted her thoughts. Why are you looking at that card so much? Emma put Alexander's card in the desk drawer. Sometimes, sweetheart, life presents us with difficult choices. The important thing is to never forget who we are and what really matters. Sophie nodded with a comical seriousness, as if she perfectly understood her mother's dilemma. Like when I have to choose between chocolate and ice cream for dessert. Emma laughed, hugging her daughter. Something like that, my love. Something like that. That night, in his mansion in Brooklyn Heights, Alexander found Ethan locked in, his room refusing to come down for dinner. He sat in the hallway leaning against his son's door. "Ethan, can we talk?" Silence. "I met someone today. Someone different. I think you might like her." On the other side of the door, Ethan rolled his eyes but couldn't help feeling a twinge of curiosity. His father rarely spoke that way, with that note of hope in his voice. The Café Latte on Bedford Avenue was particularly busy that afternoon when Emma arrived for her meeting with Alexander Hawthorne. She had chosen a simple but elegant dress, appropriate for a teacher. She wanted to make it clear that she was a professional, not someone desperate for an opportunity. "Sorry I'm late," Alexander approached, looking even more imposing in his Italian suit. "A meeting ran longer than expected." Emma observed how he seemed slightly anxious, despite his controlled posture. "No problem. Sophie stayed for her ballet class. I have some time." After they placed their orders, a double espresso for him, cappuccino for her, Alexander began to talk about Ethan. With each word, Emma realized that the situation was more complex than she had imagined. "Since Olivia left," Alexander hesitated, stirring his coffee unnecessarily. "Ethan has closed himself off in his own world. At first I thought it was just a phase, that he would get over it, but it's getting worse." "And have you tried therapy?" "Her, of course, the best professionals, but he refuses to talk. He spends the sessions in silence or making sarcastic jokes." Emma reflected for a moment. "And what's your routine like? How much time do you spend together?" Alexander looked away, visibly uncomfortable. "I try to be present, but with the company—" "I understand," Emma gently interrupted. "Mr. Hawthorne—" "Alexander, please." "Alexander, I need to be honest. Your son doesn't need another nanny. He needs presence, real connection. That's why I thought of you." Alexander leaned forward, his eyes revealing a mixture of hope and desperation. "I saw how you are with Sophie. It's not just care, it's true love. Ethan needs that." Emma sighed. "I can't promise miracles, and I have my conditions." "Which are?" "First, I want to meet Ethan before making any decision. Second, if I accept, you'll need to commit to spending more time with him. And third," she paused, choosing her words, "I don't want to be just another employee. If I'm going to do this, I need to have autonomy to make decisions about his routine." Alexander nodded slowly. "Fair enough. How about meeting him today? We can pick up Sophie from ballet and stop by my place." 2 hours later, the Mercedes was passing through the gates of the Hawthorne mansion. Sophie, in the back seat, had her eyes wide open at the imposing sight of the place. "It looks like a castle, Mom," Emma smiled, but her attention was focused on the figure watching from the second-floor window, a thin boy with dark hair who disappeared as soon as he noticed her gaze. Richard, the driver, led them to the main living room, where Alexander was waiting. The mansion was impressive, but Emma noticed subtle signs of neglect: vases without flowers, furniture with a thin layer of dust, a general feeling of emptiness that no expensive artwork could disguise. "Ethan," Alexander called, "we have visitors." Silence. "He must be in his room," Alexander began to apologize, but Emma interrupted him with a gesture. "Sophie, sweetheart, why don't you explore the garden a bit? I saw an amazing treehouse out there." The girl looked at her mother, then at Alexander, who nodded in approval. As soon as Sophie left, the sound of footsteps was heard on the upper floor. Ethan appeared at the top of the stairs, wearing a black t-shirt with a skull print and a defiant look on his face. "So this is the new nanny? How long until she gives up too?" "Ethan," Alexander warned, but Emma stepped forward. "Actually, I haven't decided if I want the job yet," she replied calmly. "It depends a lot on you." The boy blinked, clearly surprised by the response. It was the first time someone hadn't immediately tried to please him or scold him. "Why does it depend on me?" "Because I don't work with people who don't want my help. It would be a waste of time for both of us, don't you think?" Ethan descended a few steps, his curiosity momentarily overcoming his hostility. "And if I say I don't want your help?" "Then I'll thank you for the coffee," Emma smiled, indicating Alexander. and I'll go back to my life. But first, she made a strategic pause. I'd like to know your opinion on that treehouse. Sophie loved it, but she's only 8 years old. You probably have enough age for more challenging projects. A gleam passed through the boy's eyes. I renovated the house myself. I added a pulley system to lift things without having to climb down. Interesting, Emma commented. It must have been a lot of work. Do you like building things? Before Ethan could answer, a shout of excitement came from the garden. Mom, come see this. There's a real elevator here. Ethan couldn't contain a proud smile. It's not really an elevator. It's a counterweight system that... Why don't you show Sophie how it works? Emma suggested. She loves learning new things. Ethan hesitated, looking at his father as if asking for permission. Alexander, who had been observing the interaction with growing hope, nodded encouragingly. Fine, but only because she needs to know how to use it properly so she doesn't break anything, Ethan grumbled, descending the stairs. However, there was a new energy in his steps. The move happened on a Saturday morning. Emma watched the workers transporting the few boxes with her and Sophie's belongings into the Hawthorne mansion, while her daughter bounced from one side to the other, fascinated by every detail of the house. This will be your room. Alexander showed a spacious area on the second floor, with 2 queen-size beds and a privileged view of the garden. I had a desk installed for your schoolwork, Sophie. The girl impulsively hugged Alexander's waist. Thank you, Uncle Alex. Emma noticed how he was momentarily taken aback before giving an awkward pat on the girl's head. It was evident that spontaneous displays of affection were not common in that house. Across the hallway, the door to Ethan's room remained closed. Since the encounter in the treehouse, the boy had returned to his defensive posture, although Emma had noticed curious glances when he thought no one was looking. I'll leave you to get settled, Alexander said, checking his watch. I have a video conference with Chinese investors in half an hour. On a Saturday? Emma asked, raising an eyebrow. Alexander looked disconcerted. Business doesn't stop on weekends, and neither does your son, she replied softly. How about lunch all together after your meeting? Before Alexander could respond, the sound of breaking glass echoed through the hallway, followed by a muffled exclamation coming from Ethan's room. Emma moved instantly. Ethan, is everything okay? She knocked on the door, but there was no answer. I'm coming in, okay? When she opened the door, she found Ethan sitting on the floor, surrounded by shards of glass. A broken frame lay at his feet, and he was holding a photograph with trembling hands. I don't need help, he protested, but Emma was already kneeling beside him, carefully pushing away the glass shards. Let me see if you're hurt, she said firmly, ignoring his protests. Alexander watched from the doorway, hesitant between entering or keeping his distance. It's just a stupid photo, Ethan muttered, but his voice betrayed emotion. Emma could see the image. It showed a younger Ethan, smiling, with a dark-haired woman who shared his features. Part of the photo was folded, as if someone had tried to hide that piece of memory. Your mother? Emma asked softly. Ethan nodded, then quickly crumpled the photo. It doesn't matter. She didn't want to stay, so I don't want anything from her. Either. Sophie, who had approached silently, sat down next to Ethan. When I'm sad, my mom always says it's okay to cry. You don't have to pretend it doesn't hurt. Ethan looked at the girl with a mixture of irritation and surprise. You don't understand anything. You're just a kid, and you're just a hurt boy, Emma intervened, her voice firm but gentle. And that's okay, but it's not okay to hurt yourself more. She started collecting the glass shards, and after a moment of hesitation, Ethan joined her. Alexander, still at the door, seemed lost between the desire to help and the fear of making the situation worse. Mr. Hawthorne, Emma called, I think we're going to need a broom, and maybe we could order a pizza for lunch. I'm sure your Chinese investors can wait half an hour. To everyone's surprise, Ethan let out a short laugh. Pizza for lunch? Carmen never allowed that. Well, I'm not Carmen, Emma smiled, and sometimes on difficult days, we need a little cheese and dough to make things better. Alexander put away the cell phone that was already in his hand. I think I can reschedule the meeting. As they ate pizza in the living room, something that was clearly not common in that formal house, Emma observed the dynamics developing. Sophie chattered about her plans to decorate the new room, occasionally drawing reluctant smiles from Ethan. Alexander tried to maintain a casual conversation, clearly unaccustomed to family meals. "We could have a little movie night later," Sophie suggested. "I brought all my superhero DVDs." "Superhero movies are for kids," Ethan replied, but without his usual hostility. "Actually," Emma intervened, "some are quite complex. Have you watched Iron Man? It's about a son trying to deal with his father's legacy." Ethan pretended to be uninterested, but Emma noticed how he adjusted himself on the couch, paying more attention. At night, after the children had finally gone to sleep, Emma found Alexander in his office, still working. "You know," she said from the door, "today was a good day. Difficult, but good." Alexander looked up from his papers. "It was the first time in a long time that I saw Ethan laugh, even if briefly." "His wounds are deep," Emma commented. "It will take time, and it will require patience from all of us, including mine." "Especially yours," she replied. "Ethan doesn't just need someone to take care of him, he needs his father present." Alexander was silent for a moment, then closed his laptop. "Do you think there's still time to watch a bit of that superhero movie?" 3 weeks passed since Emma and Sophie's move to the Hawthorne mansion. The mornings, once silent and tense, were now filled with the sound of laughter and conversations coming from the kitchen, where Emma insisted that everyone have breakfast together before starting the day. "I can't believe you've never made pancakes," Sophie exclaimed one of these mornings, watching Ethan try to flip a pancake in the air, only to see it fall awkwardly onto the stove. "Actually, I had never been in this kitchen," Ethan admitted, as Emma cleaned up the mess with a patient smile. "Carmen said it wasn't a place for children." "Well, this is our kitchen now," Emma declared, handing the spatula back to Ethan, "and everyone needs to know how to fend for themselves, even if it's just to make a fried egg." Alexander, who had just entered the kitchen, adjusting his tie as usual, stopped in surprise to see his son trying to cook. "Ethan, what are you— Look, Dad!" The boy finally managed to flip a pancake without disaster. "I did it." Emma noticed Alexander's moment of hesitation, that microsecond where he almost reverted to being the distant businessman, before genuinely smiling. "Impressive. I think we found a new chef in the family." The word family hung in the air for a moment, loaded with meaning. Ethan pretended to be focused on his next pancake, but a small smile played on his lips. However, it wasn't all pancakes and smiles. Emma realized that despite the progress, Ethan was still struggling with his inner demons. One afternoon, upon returning from school, he locked himself in his room and refused to come out, even for dinner. "Something must have happened at school," Sophie whispered to her mother during dinner, revealing a sensitivity beyond her years. Emma nodded, exchanging a concerned look with Alexander. After the meal, she went up with a plate of food and knocked softly on Ethan's door. "I don't want to talk," came the muffled response. "That's okay," Emma replied calmly, "but I brought your dinner. And you know, sometimes when we don't want to talk, it's good to have someone just sit by our side in silence." There was a long pause before the door slowly opened. Ethan had red eyes, though he tried to hide it. "They made fun of my science project," he finally muttered, sitting on the bed as Emma placed the plate on the bedside table. "I made an automated vertical garden, but the irrigation system failed and soaked everyone during the presentation." "You know," Emma sat down beside him, "great inventors always faced setbacks. Thomas Edison failed hundreds of times before making the light bulb work." "But he didn't make a fool of himself in front of the whole class," Ethan replied bitterly. "And Zoe, she laughed louder than everyone." Ah, Emma thought, so that was it. Zoe was a classmate Ethan obviously had a crush on, though he'd never admit it. "Can I tell you a secret?" Emma smiled. "When I was your age, I tried to impress a boy by doing a gymnastics presentation at the school party. I ended up falling, flat on my face." Ethan looked at her incredulous. "Seriously?" "Seriously, and you know what I learned? That the best friends, the best loves, are those who laugh with you, not at you." At that moment, Sophie appeared at the door, carrying her toy toolbox. "Ethan, can you help me? I want to make an irrigation system for my little garden on the balcony." Emma noticed her daughter's strategy, giving Ethan the chance to be the expert, to teach something he mastered. The boy hesitated for a moment, then picked up the plate of food. "Okay, but first I need to eat. You can't work on an empty stomach." Later that night, Emma found Alexander in his office as usual, but this time, instead of working, he was looking at old photographs. "Ethan was so small when Olivia left," he said without looking up. "Sometimes I wonder if I did everything wrong since then." "There's no manual for being a parent," Emma replied, sitting in the chair in front of his desk. "Especially in difficult circumstances." "He's changing," Alexander commented. "With you and Sophie here, it's like the house is coming to life again." Emma felt a strange warmth in her chest at those words, but before she could respond, her cell phone vibrated with a message. As she read the content, her face paled slightly. "Any problem?" Alexander asked, noticing her change of expression. "No. Yes. I don't know." Emma put away her cell phone, trying to maintain her composure. "Sophie's father got in touch. After 8 years, he wants to meet her." On the balcony, the voices of Ethan and Sophie could be heard animatedly discussing irrigation systems, oblivious to the storm forming on the horizon. Emma stared at the untouched cup of tea in front of her, sitting on the mansion's porch as night fell over Brooklyn. The message from Ryan, Sophie's father, kept echoing in her mind. "I've changed, Emma. I want to be part of her life." "Can't sleep?" Alexander's voice surprised her. He was still wearing his work suit, though his tie was loose and his hair slightly disheveled. "How do I tell her?" Emma asked, her voice betraying the anguish she tried to hide during the day. "How do I tell my daughter that the father who never wanted to meet her suddenly decided he's ready?" Alexander sat in the chair next to her, pouring himself a cup of tea. "You don't have to decide that now. Sophie has always been curious about him," Emma continued, "but I kept the explanations simple, age-appropriate. Now, I'm afraid of how she'll react." A noise coming from the garden caught their attention. In the twilight, they could make out Ethan sitting in the treehouse, a lit flashlight illuminating what appeared to be his project notebook. "Ethan," Alexander called, "it's past 10. "Just a little longer," the boy replied. "I'm almost finishing. Sophie's irrigation system project." Emma and Alexander exchanged a significant look. In recent weeks, Ethan had obsessively dedicated himself to perfecting the system that had failed at school, using Sophie's small garden as a testing laboratory. "Moi Dwight. I'll go get him," Emma offered, standing up. As she walked through the garden, she noticed how the grass, once neglected, was now green and well-trimmed, another of the children's joint projects. "Ethan," she called softly as she reached the base of the treehouse. "Can I come up?" "Whatever," he replied, but his tone lacked the hostility from before. Emma skillfully climbed the rope ladder. She was getting quite practiced at this. She found Ethan hunched over his notebook, surrounded by surprisingly detailed technical drawings for his age. "You know," she commented, sitting down beside him, "engineers need sleep too." "I heard you and my dad talking," Ethan said abruptly without raising his eyes from the notebook. "About Sophie's dad." Emma felt a tightness in her chest. "Ethan, he's just like my mom, isn't he?" The boy finally looked at her, his eyes shining in the flashlight's glow. "Abandons and then thinks he can come back as if nothing happened." "Each story is different," Emma replied carefully. "But yes, sometimes the people who should protect us end up hurting us." "Sophie, she's different from me," Ethan continued, his voice low. "She always smiles, always sees the bright side of things. What if he ruins that? What if he hurts her like my mom hurt me?" Emma felt her eyes fill with tears. In just a few weeks, Ethan had developed a protective instinct towards Sophie that no one could have predicted. "Is that why you're working so hard on this project? To protect her?" Ethan shrugged, but his hands tightened on the notebook. "I want it to work right this time. I want her to be proud." The next day, during breakfast, Sophie was especially excited, talking about the upcoming science fair. "Ethan is going to help. "May present the vertical garden," she announced as she devoured her pancakes. "It's going to be the best project in the school." Emma exchanged a look with Alexander, who nodded discreetly. It was time. "Sophie, sweetheart," Emma began, sitting next to her daughter, "I need to talk to you about something important." "Is it about my dad?" Sophie asked, surprising everyone. "I heard you crying last night, Mom." Ethan dropped his fork, suddenly tense. Alexander placed a hand on his shoulder, a silent gesture of support. "Yes, it's about your dad," Emma confirmed, once again admiring her daughter's perceptiveness. "He got in touch. He wants to meet you." Sophie was silent for a moment, playing with the rest of her pancake. "Is he going to live with us here in the mansion?" "No, sweetheart," Emma hurried to clarify. "He just wants to have the opportunity to meet you, but only if you want to." "And if I don't want to?" Sophie asked, her voice small. "Then he'll have to respect your decision," Alexander intervened, his voice firm. "No one in this house will be forced to do something they don't want to." Ethan looked at his father with an expression of surprise and something close to pride. "Can I think about it?" Sophie asked, turning to her mother. "After the science fair? Ethan and I need to focus on our project now." Emma hugged her daughter, feeling a mixture of pride and relief. "Of course you can, my love, all the time you need." "And Sophie," Ethan called, his voice a little hesitant, "no matter what you decide, you'll always have a family here." Sophie nodded with a comical seriousness, as if she perfectly understood her friend's dilemma. "Like when I have to choose between chocolate and ice cream for dessert," Emma laughed, hugging her daughter. "Something like that, my love, something like that." That night, in his room in the Brooklyn Heights mansion, Ethan found himself unable to sleep. He sat at his desk, surrounded by sketches and calculations for the irrigation system. His mind, however, was far from the project. The conversation he had overheard about Sophie's father kept replaying in his head. He couldn't shake the feeling of protectiveness he felt towards the little girl who had, in such a short time, become like a sister to him. A soft knock on his door startled him. "Ethan, are you still awake?" It was his father's voice, tentative and unsure. "Come in," Ethan replied, surprised by his own lack of resistance. Alexander entered, still in his work clothes but with his tie loosened and jacket off. He looked around the room, taking in the scattered papers and the glowing computer screen. "You've been working hard on this project," he commented, picking up one of the sketches. Ethan shrugged. "It has to be perfect. For Sophie." Alexander sat on the edge of the bed, facing his son. "You know, you remind me a lot of myself at your age, always trying to make everything perfect." "You?" Ethan scoffed. "But you're always perfect." A sad smile crossed Alexander's face. "Far from it, son. I've made many mistakes. The biggest one was not being there for you when you needed me most." Ethan felt a lump in his throat. He wanted to say something sarcastic, to push his father away as he had done so many times before, but something had changed. Maybe it was Emma's influence or Sophie's unwavering cheerfulness, or maybe he was just tired of being angry all the time. "Dad," he started, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think Sophie's dad will hurt her like Mom hurt us?" Alexander took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I don't know, son, but what I do know is that Sophie has something you didn't have when your mother left." "What's that?" "A whole family ready to protect and support her no matter what happens, including a very dedicated big brother." Ethan felt his eyes sting with unshed tears. Without thinking, he stood up and hugged his father tightly. Alexander, momentarily stunned, wrapped his arms around his son, holding him close. "I'm sorry, Ethan," Alexander whispered. "I'm so sorry for not being the father you needed, but I promise I'm trying to change." As they embraced, neither noticed. Sophie, peeking through the partially open door, a small smile on her face before she tiptoed back to her room. The next morning, the kitchen was filled with an unusual energy. Ethan, typically sullen and withdrawn during breakfast, was animatedly explaining the intricacies of the irrigation system to Sophie, who listened with rapt attention. Emma watched the scene with a mixture of joy and apprehension. The science fair was approaching rapidly, and with it the looming decision about Sophie's father. She felt a gentle touch on her shoulder and turned to see Alexander, a soft smile on his face. "They're going to be okay," he said quietly. "We all are." As the days passed, the Hawthorne mansion buzzed with activity. The backyard had been transformed into a makeshift laboratory, with Ethan and Sophie working tirelessly on their vertical garden. Emma marveled at how the once isolated boy now patiently explained every detail of the irrigation system to his young protege. "And this sensor here," Ethan was explaining, showing a small device to Sophie, "will measure the soil moisture. When it's too dry, the system turns on automatically." "How does it know how much water it needs?" Sophie asked, her eyes shining with curiosity. "I program different levels for each type of plant," Ethan replied, evident pride in his voice. "Some need more water, others less." Alexander, who had started coming home earlier from work to monitor the project's progress, approached with a box in his hands. "What's that, Dad?" Ethan asked, trying to disguise his interest. "Some electronic components I thought might be useful," Alexander replied, placing the box on the ground. "I found a specialty store on the way from the office." Ethan opened the box as if it were an early Christmas present. "These are state-of-the-art sensors, and there's even an LCD display. I thought you could use it to show real-time information during the presentation," Alexander commented, trying to sound casual, but his smile betrayed him. Sophie jumped for joy. "It's going to be even cooler. Ethan, can we add colored lights too?" As the children pored over the new equipment, Emma approached Alexander. "You're different," she observed. "How so?" "More present, more dad-like." Alexander watched his son animatedly explaining to Sophie how each component worked. "I realized I was missing the important moments. I always thought providing material comfort was enough, but nothing replaces time together," Emma completed softly. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of the doorbell. Richard, the driver, appeared in the garden a few minutes later. "Ms. Emma," he called, looking uncomfortable. "There's a man at the gate asking for you. Says he's Sophie's father." The silence that followed was heavy. Sophie dropped the sensor she was holding, and Ethan instantly placed himself at her side like a small guardian. "He shouldn't be here," Emma muttered, her face pale. "Not without warning." "Do you want me to send him away?" Alexander asked, his voice tense. Emma looked at Sophie, who seemed smaller and more fragile than ever. "Sweetie, you don't have to—" "I want to see him," Sophie interrupted, her voice trembling slightly. "But can Ethan stay with me?" Ethan nodded immediately, holding his friend's hand. Minutes later, Ryan entered the garden. He was a tall, well-dressed man with the same shade of brown hair as Sophie. His eyes scanned the space until they found his daughter, and for a moment he seemed at a loss for words. "Sophie," he began, taking a step forward, but stopped when he saw Ethan protectively squeeze her hand. "Hi," Sophie replied simply, her usual exuberance replaced by a caution that broke Emma's heart. I brought you a present," Ryan tried again, extending an elaborately wrapped package. "We're busy right now," Ethan intervened, his voice surprisingly firm. "We have an important science fair to prepare for." Ryan looked confusedly at the boy, then at Emma, who maintained a calculated distance. "I didn't know you had another child." "Ethan is my heart brother," Sophie declared, finding her voice. "And he's teaching me about automated irrigation systems." "Irrigation system? But you're just a child," Ryan laughed nervously. "Shouldn't you be playing with dolls?" Sophie's face closed off. "I like science and planting things, and Ethan is the best teacher in the world." Alexander, who had remained silent, took a step forward. "Mr. Ryan, perhaps it's better if we schedule another time. The children are really busy with their project." "Project?" Ryan seemed increasingly lost. "Emma, what kind of environment is this? Our daughter should be having a normal childhood, not playing with machines." "Sophie is having exactly the childhood she deserves," Emma replied, her voice controlled but firm. "Full of love, learning, and people who support her interests. You lost the right to have an opinion on this 8 years ago." A tense silence settled in the garden, broken only by the distant sound of Brooklyn traffic. Sophie looked at the gift, still in her father's hands, Then at the vertical garden she and Ethan had been building with so much care. "You can leave the present," she said finally. "But now I need to get back to work. We have to finish the project by Friday." Ryan placed the package on a nearby bench, clearly unprepared for the maturity and determination of the daughter he barely knew. Can I come back another day?" Sophie looked at Ethan, then at her mother, and finally at Alexander, as if seeking strength from her new family. "Maybe, after the science fair. Now I have more important things to do." The school gymnasium was unrecognizable that Friday. Dozens of stands occupied the space, decorated with colorful posters and elaborate models. The buzz of excited voices mingled with the sound of experiments in progress and ongoing presentations. Ethan nervously adjusted the last sensor of the irrigation system, while Sophie organized the plant seedlings in the vertical garden they had carefully transported from the mansion. The LCD display flashed with information about moisture and temperature levels exactly as they had planned. "Everything is perfect," Emma assured, observing Ethan's anxiety. "You both worked very hard on this." "What if it fails again?" Ethan whispered, his hands trembling slightly as he calibrated the sensor. "Like last time?" "Then you explain what you learned from the error and how you corrected it," Alexander replied, surprising everyone with his early arrival. He wore an impeccable suit, but there was something different about his posture, a softness that contrasted with his usual business formality. "Dad, didn't you have that important meeting today?" "Nothing is more important than this," Alexander smiled, adjusting the collar of the polo shirt Ethan was wearing, a combination suggested by Emma to make him more comfortable during the presentation. Sophie, who had run to hug Alexander, turned, her attention to the gymnasium entrance. "Look, Zoe is coming!" Ethan immediately tensed. Zoe, the girl who had laughed at his previous project, was approaching with her parents. Her eyes widened as she saw the elaborate system occupying the stand. "Wow," she murmured, stopping to observe. "This is amazing." "Ethan taught me everything about automated systems," Sophie proudly declared. "Do you want to see how it works?" Before Zoe could answer, a familiar voice sounded behind them. "Can I see too?" Ryan was standing there holding a bouquet of flowers and looking uncertain. Sophie hesitated for a moment, looking at her mother. Emma nodded discreetly. "It's your choice, sweetie." "Okay," Sophie replied after a pause. "But Ethan will explain with me. We did it together." What followed was a presentation that none of those present would forget. Ethan and Sophie alternated in their explanations, finishing each other's sentences with a natural synchronicity. He explained the technical aspects of the system, while she talked about the different needs of each plant and how the project helped conserve water. "The sensor automatically detects when the plant needs water," Ethan explained, his confidence growing with each word. "And the best part, the whole system was made with recycled and low-cost materials. It means anyone can have one at home," Sophie enthusiastically complimented. "I even made one in my room." Zoe, who had remained to hear the entire explanation, timidly raised her hand. Could you teach me how to make one too?" Ethan's smile lit up his face. "Of course, we could form a science club." Ryan observed everything with a complex expression, a mixture of pride and sadness, as if finally realizing all he had missed in the last 8 years. "She's brilliant," he commented quietly to Emma. "And happy. You did an amazing job." "We did," Emma corrected, indicating Alexander and Ethan with a gesture. "Family isn't just about blood, Ryan. It's about who chooses to stay and support no matter what." The afternoon progressed, and Ethan and Sophie's project attracted more and more attention. Teachers praised the technical complexity. Other parents were interested in the practicality and sustainability, and children were enchanted by the colored lights that indicated the different irrigation levels. "I knew you could do it," Alexander commented proudly, when they finally had a moment of pause. "This deserves a special celebration." "Can we make homemade pizza?" Sophie suggested, her eyes shining. "Ethan promised to teach me how to make dough." "Since when do you know how to make pizza dough?" Alexander asked his son in surprise. "Emma taught me," Ethan replied, blushing slightly. "On weekends, when you were traveling. A flash of guilt crossed Alexander's face, but was quickly replaced by determination. Well, I think it's time for me to learn too. It can be our next family project. The word family now sounded different, more true, deeper. It was no longer just a word, but a reality they had built together day by day, between irrigation systems and burnt pancakes, between moments of doubt and small victories. Ryan, who had not yet left, observed the scene from a distance. Emma approached him, her voice soft but firm. You'll always be her father, Ryan, but you need to understand that she has a life, a family. If you want to be part of it, you'll have to accept and respect what we've built. On stage, the judges were preparing to announce the winners of the fair, but for that small group gathered around the vertical garden, the real prize had already been won. Something much more precious than any medal or trophy. The first place medal from the science fair now occupied a prominent place in the living room of the Hawthorne mansion, next to a framed photo of Ethan and Sophie smiling in front of their project. But the real changes went far beyond trophies and recognition. On a Sunday afternoon, about 2 weeks after the fair, the mansion was buzzing with unusual activity. The kitchen, once a practically abandoned space, was now taken over by flour, tomato sauce, and various ingredients spread across the counter. Dad, you're putting too much cheese, Ethan laughed, watching Alexander exaggerate the topping on his pizza. It's going to overflow in the oven like that. It's impossible to have too much cheese, Alexander replied with comic seriousness, adding even more mozzarella. Emma observed the scene with a smile, while helping Sophie shape her own dough. The girl had insisted on making a heart-shaped pizza. Because that's how our family is, she had explained. The sound of the doorbell interrupted the culinary activity. Richard appeared in the kitchen doorway moments later, his face revealing a worried expression. Mr. Hawthorne, there's a lady at the gate. She says she's Ethan's mother. The silence that followed was deafening. The piece of mozzarella Alexander was holding fell onto the counter with a dull thud. Ethan, who seconds before had been laughing, carefreely went rigid. His voice, when he finally spoke, was just a whisper. Olivia? Emma immediately moved close to him, placing a protective hand on his shoulder. Sophie, sensing the tension, abandoned her heart-shaped dough and positioned herself next to her friend. She shouldn't be here, Alexander muttered, more to himself than to the others. Not after so long. What do you want me to do? Richard asked, still standing in the doorway. Ethan looked at his father, then at Emma, his eyes revealing a mixture of fear and determination. I want to see her. Ethan, you don't have to, Alexander began, but his son interrupted him. Yes, I do. Dad, but... He hesitated, squeezing Sophie's hand that had held his. I want Emma and Sophie to stay with me. Alexander nodded slowly, then turned to Richard. Ask her to wait in the living room. Minutes later, which seemed like hours, Olivia entered the room. She was elegantly dressed, as always, but there was something different in her eyes, a mixture of regret and surprise as she observed the domestic scene she had interrupted. Ethan, she began, her voice choked. How you've grown. Ethan remained silent, still firmly holding Sophie's hand. Flour stained his t-shirt, and there was a small smear of tomato sauce on his cheek, but he stood erect, facing his mother's gaze. What do you want, Olivia? Alexander asked, his voice controlled but tense. I came to make things right this time, she replied, taking a step forward. I've been in therapy, worked on my issues. I realized how much harm I caused, how much I lost. 5 years, Ethan finally spoke, his voice surprisingly firm. It took you 5 years to realize this. Olivia blinked, clearly surprised by the maturity in her son's voice. Her eyes scanned the environment, noticing the changes in decor, the science fair medal, the recent photos. Who are they? She asked, indicating Emma and Sophie with a gesture. My family, Ethan replied simply. The family that chose to stay. Sophie squeezed his hand in silent support, while Emma kept a firm hand on his shoulder. Ethan, darling, Olivia tried again, her voice honeyed. I know I made mistakes, but I'm your mother. Blood is thicker than anything. No, Ethan interrupted, his voice trembling slightly. Blood is just blood. Family is who makes pancakes with you in the morning, even when they burn. It's who stays up late helping with science projects. It's who hugs you when you're sad and celebrates when you're happy. Emma felt her eyes fill with tears, but she remained steadfast beside Ethan. "Look at you," Olivia commented, a touch of bitterness in her voice, "all covered in flour, playing house. This isn't the environment I imagined for my son." "No," Alexander intervened, his voice laden with emotion. "It's much better, it's real." Ethan released Sophie's hand and took a step forward. "You know why we're covered in flour? Because we're making pizza, as a family. And you know something? For the first time in my life, I know exactly where I belong." Olivia opened her mouth to respond, but was interrupted by a burning smell coming from the kitchen. "The pizza," Sophie exclaimed, breaking the tension. "Must be Dad's," Ethan commented, a small smile appearing on his lips. "I warned him about too much cheese." The moment of levity, so natural and spontaneous, seemed to highlight even more how out of place Olivia was in that scene. She looked at her son, now laughing at something Sophie was whispering in his ear, and for the first time seemed to really see what she had lost, and what she could never recover. The scent of fresh flowers filled the garden of the Hawthorne mansion on a sunny Saturday morning, 6 months after Olivia's unexpected visit. The space, once neglected, now displayed an exuberance of colors and life, reflecting the transformations that had occurred not only in the environment, but in the people who lived there. The vertical garden created by Ethan and Sophie had multiplied, occupying several walls of the backyard. Their irrigation systems worked perfectly, keeping the plants always lush. After the success at the science fair, other parents had become interested in the project, and the children now coordinated a small gardening club on weekends. "Be careful with those orchids," Ethan instructed Zoe, who had become a constant presence in the club's activities. "They need less water than the other plants." Sophie, now 9 years old, supervised another group of children learning about composting. Her natural flair for teaching was very reminiscent of her mother. Emma observed everything from the porch, next to Alexander, who had surprisingly swapped his weekend suits for comfortable gardening clothes. "Who would have thought," she commented, smiling, that boy who didn't even want to leave his room would now be teaching other children?" Alexander took her hand, a gesture that had become natural in recent months. "Who would have thought that I would learn that there are things more important than business meetings?" The sound of more cars arriving announced the arrival of other parents. Among them, Ryan got out of his vehicle carrying a plant seedling. After many conversations and established boundaries, he had found his place in that family dynamic, no longer as a central figure in Sophie's life, but as someone who was learning to respect his daughter's space and choices. "I brought that. Fern you mentioned, Sophie," he said, approaching the group. "Yay," Sophie exclaimed, running to examine the plant. "It'll be perfect on the new panel Ethan designed." Emma observed the interaction with a serene smile. Things had naturally adjusted, each person finding their own rhythm and place in that complex family dance. Olivia's last visit had served as a catalyst for important changes. After that confrontation in the kitchen, Ethan had finally been able to express his repressed feelings, and the process of true healing could begin. She still tried to maintain contact through occasional messages, but now it was Ethan who established the boundaries of that relationship. "Everyone," Ethan called for attention. "Time to reveal the new project." The children from the club gathered excitedly as Ethan and Sophie removed a cloth covering their latest creation, a spiral-shaped vertical garden system with different levels and types of plants, all automatically irrigated through an even more sophisticated system than the previous one. "The idea is to create a complete ecosystem," Sophie explained, her voice overflowing with enthusiasm. "Each plant helps the other grow better. Just like our family," Ethan added, exchanging a meaningful look with Emma and his father. Alexander cleared his throat, trying to disguise his emotion. "I think it's time to make that announcement." Emma nodded, her heart racing slightly. "Kids, can you come here for a moment?" Ethan and Sophie approached, curious. Zoe and the other children continued exploring the new garden, supervised by Ryan and other parents. "Well," Alexander began, his voice softer than usual, Emma and I have been talking a lot in recent weeks. About family, about belonging, about love. Dad, Ethan asked, a note of expectation in his voice. What do you think about making this official? Emma completed, squeezing Alexander's hand. About being on paper the family we already are in our hearts. Sophie was the first to understand, her eyes widening. Are you going to get married? If you're okay with it, Alexander replied, anxiously observing Ethan's reaction. The boy was silent for a moment, processing the information. Then slowly a huge smile lit up his face. Does this mean Sophie will officially be my sister? And that we'll be a real family, Emma confirmed, her eyes misty. Even more than we already are. The group hug that followed was spontaneous and full of meaning. There, in the middle of the garden they had cultivated together, among plants that grew strong and healthy thanks to mutual care, a new family was consolidating, not out of obligation or blood, but by choice, love, and complicity. Hey, Sophie said suddenly, this means we'll have to organize a party, right? Definitely, Ethan replied, already starting to plan. And I already know how we're going to decorate. A giant, vertical garden with LED lights that change color. According to the music, Alexander and Emma exchanged an amused look. The Hawthorne mansion, once a cold and empty place, had transformed into a true home, filled with laughter, shared projects, and above all, true love. In the end, it wasn't blood ties that defined a family, but the bonds one chose to cultivate. Day after day, like the plants in the garden, with patience, dedication, and lots of affection. And there, in that space they had transformed together, these bonds flourished stronger and more beautiful each day. The weeks leading up to Alexander and Emma's wedding were a whirlwind of activity. The children threw themselves into the preparations with characteristic enthusiasm, turning the event planning into their newest project. Ethan, with his newfound confidence, took charge of the technical aspects. He designed an intricate lighting system for the garden, programming LEDs to change colors in sync with the music. Sophie, ever the artist, worked on floral arrangements and decorations, insisting on incorporating elements from their vertical garden into the wedding decor. One afternoon, as Emma was going through RSVPs in the study, she heard raised voices from the kitchen. Concerned, she made her way there, only to find Ethan and Sophie in a heated debate over cake flavors. But chocolate is classic, Ethan argued, waving a spatula for emphasis. Everyone likes chocolate. Not everyone, Sophie countered, hands on her hips. What about people with allergies? We should do vanilla with strawberry filling. It's more inclusive. Emma leaned against the doorframe, watching the scene with a mixture of amusement and pride. These were the same kids who, just months ago, had been strangers to each other. Now they bickered like siblings who had known each other all their lives. How about we do both, she suggested, making her presence known. A two-tier cake with different flavors? The children looked at each other, then back at Emma. Can we do that? Sophie asked, eyes wide. It's our family wedding, Emma smiled. We can do whatever we want. As the big day approached, there was one more hurdle to overcome. Alexander and Emma had decided to have a frank conversation with Ryan and Olivia about their new family dynamic. The four adults sat in the living room, an awkward silence hanging in the air. Emma took a deep breath and began. We wanted to talk to you both because, regardless of the past, you're part of our children's lives. This wedding, this new family we're creating, it doesn't erase your roles, but it does change things. Ryan nodded slowly. I understand, and I want you to know I'm grateful. You've given Sophie a stability and love that I wasn't ready to provide before. Olivia, however, seemed less at ease. I just don't understand why this is necessary. Ethan has a mother, me. Alexander leaned forward, his voice firm but not unkind. Olivia, Ethan does have a mother, but he also has Emma now and Sophie. And me in a way he didn't before. We're not asking for your approval, but for your understanding. This is what Ethan wants. What makes him happy? There was a tense moment as Olivia processed this. Finally, she said softly, I've missed so much. I don't want to miss anymore. If this is what Ethan wants, then I'll try to understand. The day of the wedding dawned bright and clear. The Hawthorne mansion's garden had been transformed into a fairy tale setting with twinkling lights and flowers everywhere. Guests milled about, admiring the vertical gardens that served as living decorations. As Emma stood before a mirror, adjusting her simple but elegant white dress, there was a knock at the door. "Come in," she called. Sophie entered, looking adorable in her flower girl dress. "Mom," she said, her voice uncharacteristically serious, "I have something for you." She held out a small, clumsily wrapped package. Emma unwrapped it carefully to find a handmade bracelet, woven with threads in various shades of green. "Oh, Sophie, it's beautiful." "Ethan helped me make it," Sophie explained proudly. "It's got all the colors of our garden, so you can carry a piece of our home with you." Tears pricked Emma's eyes as she hugged her daughter tightly. "It's perfect, sweetheart, thank you." Meanwhile, in another room, Alexander was having a similar moment with Ethan. The boy stood awkwardly in his suit, fidgeting with his tie. "Here, let me help," Alexander offered, kneeling to adjust the tie. As he did so, he noticed Ethan's hands were shaking slightly. "Nervous, buddy?" Ethan shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant. "A little, I guess." "Dad, are you sure about this? About us being a real family?" Alexander's hands stilled. He looked his son in the eye, seeing the vulnerability there. "Ethan, listen to me. We've been a real family for months now. This wedding, it's just making official what we already know in our hearts. Emma and Sophie, they're not replacing anyone. They're adding to our family, making it richer, fuller, do you understand?" Ethan nodded, a small smile forming. "Yeah, I do. Thanks, Dad." As the ceremony began, guests watched with misty eyes as Sophie walked down the aisle, scattering flower petals. Ethan followed, carrying the rings on a small cushion, his chest puffed with pride. But it was the sight of Emma walking, arm in arm with both children, that truly captured the essence of the day. It wasn't just a bride walking towards her groom, it was a family walking towards their future together. Alexander's voice shook slightly as he recited his vows. "Emma, you didn't just come into my life. You breathed life back into this home, into me, into Ethan. You showed us what it means to be a family. You and Sophie, you're the missing pieces. We didn't even know we were missing." Emma, tears flowing freely now, responded, "Alexander, Ethan, you opened your home and your hearts to us. You've given Sophie the family she always dreamed of, and you've given me a love I never thought I'd find. Today, we're not just joining two people, but two families, two hearts, into one." As they sealed their vows with a kiss, Ethan's carefully programmed lights burst into a symphony of colors. Cheers erupted from the guests, none louder than Sophie's excited squeal. The reception that followed was a joyous affair. The two-tiered cake, chocolate and vanilla with strawberry filling, was a hit. Ethan and Sophie insisted on making a speech together, alternating sentences in a way that had become their signature style. "When Emma and Sophie first came here," Ethan began, "we were strangers," Sophie continued. "But now we're family," Ethan smiled. "And family means nobody gets left behind," Sophie added. "Or forgotten," they finished together. As the night wore on, Emma found a quiet moment to observe her new family. Alexander was attempting to dance with both kids at once, resulting in a lot of laughter and stepped-on toes. She felt a presence beside her and turned to see Ryan and Olivia standing a bit awkwardly to the side. "It's a beautiful wedding," Ryan offered. "Sophie looks so happy." "Ethan too," Olivia added softly. I can see now what you've built here. It's good." Emma smiled at them both. "Thank you for being here. It means a lot to the kids and to us." As if on cue, Sophie came running up. "Mom, come dance with us, you too, Mr. Ryan and Miss Olivia." And so, under the twinkling lights of the garden they had nurtured together, this unusual, beautiful, blended family danced. It wasn't perfect. There would still be challenges ahead, adjustments to make, wounds to heal. But it was real, and it was theirs. In the years that followed, the Hawthorne Mansion continued to be a place of growth, love, and new beginnings. The vertical garden expanded, becoming a neighborhood attraction. Ethan and Sophie's science club evolved into a community program, teaching sustainable gardening to kids from all over Brooklyn. And every year on their anniversary, Alexander and Emma would look at each other over a home-cooked meal, surrounded by their children, and marvel at the beautiful life they had grown together. For in the end, they had learned the most important lesson, that families like gardens flourish best when tended with patience, nurtured with love, and allowed to grow in their own unique way.